So welcome to all of you this evening to our Sunday at the Abbey presentation. And as I've said before, for those of you who've been here in the past, this year we've invited 6 women writers to reflect on the work of writing and editing and all that goes into that as a spiritual practice. And we're delighted to have Miss Patricia Hampl as our presenter this evening. She was born in St. Paul, and you'll know that if you read her work. She earned her BA at the University of Minnesota in 1968, and then went on to the University of Iowa, a university famous for its writing and famous for its attention to good writing, and there she earned an MFA. She's best known for her memoirs. Her first memoir, A Romantic Education, dealt with her Czech heritage and won her the Houghton Mifflin Literary Fellowship in 1981. Years ago, we first read her successive volume, Virgin Time, In Search of the Contemplative Life, in our monastic dining room. And that's really when I first became aware of you as a writer, Patricia. Okay, it's a memoir that dealt with her Catholic upbringing. She also won critical acclaim for a 2007 memoir, The Florist's Daughter, which was about her mother's death. And her most recent book is The Art of the Wasted Day. It's a reflection on contemporary life and just, what do we do in the face of the grocery lists that fill our lives? How do we claim time for imagination, for integration, for really kind of trying to grab a hold of our lives again? As I was reading this, Patricia, I was thinking, I think my dad was a daydreamer, huh? He resisted lists. He really did. So the title of your presentation this evening is How to Get the Me Out of Memoir, Autobiography as Spiritual Exercise. Please give a warm Collegeville welcome to Patricia.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming, for having me here. It's always an occasion for me when I can come to St. John's. I thought I was the last in the series, and so I was going to say I think all the good things have already been said, so I'm kind of the caboose, but I think there are 1 or 2 more coming after me. But I still think of myself as the caboose of this long train of women who are talking to you about writing and its relationship to the spirit. And that reminded me, I am a memoirist, so I'm always being reminded of things, of when I lived literally on the other side of the tracks as a small child in St. Paul, and I would run up the end of the block to where the train went, and I loved to watch the train go by, and I especially loved the caboose because it was a different color, and it was the right size. It wasn't as big as all the other things, and often you would see 2 men sitting there talking, it appeared, and drinking coffee. And I thought, that's the kind of train I want to be on. So, and I hope we can take that as a bit of a model for, yes, I'm going to talk and yammer on here about various things I hope might be useful to you, but, or at least interesting. But the really interesting part will be when we get to talk together. And I don't just mean Q&A where you do the Q's and I do the A's. It's possible that you will have all of the answers and a lot of complaints and protests. And you are welcome to interject at any time I'm talking, but we'll certainly have nice time to talk back and forth. In my experience, that's always the best part. I would like to begin, though, with honoring a great loss that occurred to us on Friday. The great poet W.S. Merwin died on his he restored a plantation, a pineapple plantation with native palms in a wonderful place, I've not seen it, but a wonderful place named Haiku. Isn't that a great place for a poet to live, in Haiku on Maui? And he was one of the poets that meant a great deal to me when I started out as a poet. I really am practicing without a license here because I've never taken a prose writing class, only poetry. And in fact, the only prose writing class I ever took was, as we all did, freshman English. And true confession, I got an F on my first paper because I wrote 3 paragraphs when we were assigned to write 1 paragraph, thus inaugurating a lifelong habit of overwriting. So anyway, the poets are close to my heart, and I love W.S. Merwin, and I thought this would be a perfect invocation for us, not only to honor him and remember him, but this little poem is called Writing Lives, and it's dedicated to the great biographer Leon Edel. But we're going to be talking about writing lives, your lives. Writing lives. Out of a life it is done, and without ever knowing how things will turn out, or what a life is for that matter any life at all. The leaf in the sunlight, the voice in the day, the author in the words, and the invisible words themselves in whose lives we appear and learn to speak, until what is said seems to be almost everything that can be known. One way with the words is to tell the lives of others, using the distance as a lens. And another way is when there is no distance, so that water is looking at water, as when on a winter morning, as early as you can remember, while the plains were whitening in the light before dawn, you saw your uncle, was it your uncle? Reach from the shadow and wash his face. To us it is clear that if a single moment could be seen complete, it would disclose the whole. There is still that light in the water before sunrise, the untold day. And in a way, I'm hoping to talk my way to that moment of that little moment that you can each think of as what you want to do to connect your writing life to your spiritual life. In a way, I guess I'd have to say I kind of, there's not a lot of truth in advertising in that title, How to Get the Me Out of Memoir. In some ways, I want to talk about what we mean by me when we're writing memoir. In order to do that, I think I need to do a little, if you allow me, a brief recap of our recent history of memoir. It won't be too tedious, I don't think. When I started writing memoir, when my first memoir was published in 1981, the book did not have the word memoir on it, because nobody would have thought that somebody in her 30s would write a memoir, because the idea of memoir at that time, in the early 80s, was it was a retrospective, it was, you had to be famous, or you had to be infamous, or you had to have slept with somebody who was famous, or you, in some way, you had to be telling some kind of tall tale. Well, I was nobody, and nothing had happened to me, and I was young. What was I doing? In some ways, what I was doing, and what a lot of other people began doing at that time, was claiming this form, this first-person narrative voice, for the quest literature of our time. And what is more of a quest than our spiritual lives, certainly. I mean, I don't mean that we set out to do this and knew we were doing it, but in fact, that's what it was about. In some ways, maybe the thing to think about is Dante at the beginning of his great poem, when he says, "In the middle of the journey of our life, I came to myself within a dark wood where the straight way was lost." And that notion of being in midlife, not at the end looking back, but at a sort of a stopping point, and not actually a stopping point that you really wanted, but just kind of stopped. And you have to figure out how to go forward. So what happened at that moment was that in our American literature was that memoir became not a retrospective or reminiscent form, but it became a quest literature. And in a sense, that's what makes it connect to our first and I think most important spiritual autobiographer. But I have another tiny story to tell about my own experience. So that was 81. And I would go into bookstores pretending to look for a book by somebody else, of course, and really looking for my own book, right? It was the first, well, not the first book I'd published, but the first kind of, bigger book that I'd published. And I couldn't find it. I mean, it wasn't to be found. Sometimes it would be in women's studies. Sometimes it would be in art history. This was the one about growing up Czech and it was a Cold War book. Sometimes it would be in a political section, a history section, and on one very unhappy day, it was in self-help. So I did not have a happy time, and when I went to Scribner's, which is now a makeup store, but they gave away their bookstore in New York, and I said, I'm wondering if you have a book called A Romantic Education by Patricia Hampl. Why? Did you write it? And so I was found out, ran out the door. Anyway, that was 1981. You could not find a section called Memoir. 92, I published a couple other books, and then in 92 I published another memoir. This one was the one that Abbott Clausen mentioned, was about growing up Catholic and seeking St. Francis in Italy. Who wouldn't want to go to Italy? And all of a sudden, there's a section in the bookstore called Memoir. So in that 10-year period, that decade, the genre established itself. And they put the word memoir on the book. They certainly didn't put it on the first one. And people began to have arguments about what memoir was, whether it was nonfiction. Somebody said, we made a terrible mistake when we housed memoir under nonfiction. We should call it non-poetry. That the enterprise is really lyric. So I was on a plane giving a reading in, of all places, Fairbanks, Alaska. So I got on the plane in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and sat in the middle seat, and next to me comes a young man who had just graduated from a college in Virginia. He was going home to Fairbanks, and he told me what he was doing. He had just graduated. I'd forgotten what field. And he said, and what do you do? I said, well, I'm a writer. And he said, what do you write? And I expected him to say, as everybody always had, novels, at which point I was going to have to roll out my thing about, no, actually it's memoir, it's not really about me, it's about things that I'm interested in. And he said, what do you write? Memoirs? I almost fell out of my chair, which would be hard to do in the middle seat on a plane, but, and I realized at that moment, probably that was in late 90s, maybe about the turn of the millennium, that people were teaching these books. They were teaching memoir and personal essay, and this meant that there was a readership that was developing and an understanding. But really, my relationship, as I had been thinking about this, because I didn't mean to write about myself, it was very bad news to me. I'd been brought up not to talk about myself. And I also wanted to be an artist, which I thought meant you had to make stuff up. If you were just writing about what happened to you, then surely you were lacking. But I kept being drawn into this interesting form, which allowed me not just to talk about myself. I wasn't interested in that, but from myself. And this is the part, I think, that has to do with spirituality, that what you're looking for is that part of yourself that attaches itself to the earliest Western commandment, which is know thyself. Know thyself, the oracle at Delphi says. And that, I've always, sidebar on that, I've always loved it, that we tend to keep the second person singular for that particular phrase. We don't use thee and they, or thee and thy elsewhere. But we typically, when we quote that line, we don't say know yourself. we say, know thyself, as if we understand that what's being asked of us is an intimacy about the self that goes beyond emotion and psychology and into that realm impossible really to describe, but which is in fact the spirit. So as I began thinking about this, I who have spent all my life reading long novels and loving them and wishing I would be writing one, I suddenly realized, wow, the memoir isn't a new form. There was this man, a bishop, an unwilling bishop, who sat down in North Africa in 397 and began writing a book that we now see as the first autobiography, Augustine, of course, who, interestingly, his confessions are not about, wow, I was this sinner and now I've been saved and let me tell you what it feels like to be saved. He wasn't really doing that. He was doing a lot of what the job is now. He was actually talking about why he didn't understand who God was. And he said, maybe what I can do is seek God without knowing who he is, without knowing God. This sounds very modern to us, to take doubt and to use that as your way forward rather than the enemy, your companion in your spiritual life. The other thing about Augustine, and I've written a long chapter about him, and because I wanted this to be more back and forth with us, I'm not going to be reading stuff to you. But I read it to myself today, and I thought, it's not so bad. What I liked about Augustine was not only his voice and his spirit, but the book itself. We tend to focus on the narrative, his story about, the pears that he stole and, his fight against the flesh and all that stuff, and his mother problems, You'd think he was Jewish, he had such a mother problem. And then I realized, yes, but the last 4 books of the Confessions are not about his life story. They are really an essay in which he tries to contend with the whole question of what memory is. The whole idea of memory and how it is all we have to know who we are. That know thyself commandment is best known through memory. Not because our memories are accurate. We know very well that we can be incredibly inaccurate, but because memory is indelible, those images we have. And so what I've come to believe is that we need to not think about memory and memoir and its use in spiritual writing as a story beginning, middle, and end, but rather to think of it as our own personal picture album, snapshots, and that we take a snapshot, put it before us, and really write that scene, write that image, write that moment. And it may be all you have is your mother's hand as she is washing the dishes. It's somehow indelible. But if you write that, you begin to have a relationship with her that you never had before. The writing causes that to happen. This is the only spirituality I can begin to understand. The relationship between the impacted image and the effort of articulation. To put those two things together, imperfect is to know thyself. And so it's what I'm kind of encouraging people to do. To think of things as snapshots, not as a story, not as something that you have to put together. As a model for this, I'm thinking of a local boy, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who in 1936 wrote at the nadir of his life. He was a failure. He was a drunk. He had no money. He had been fired from working even on screenplays. His wife was in a mental institution, and his daughter, he could not even provide a home for her. His agent had her living with him and his wife. Fitzgerald wrote 3 essays, which were published in Esquire. They were called the Crack-Up Essays. And they were published on 3 successive issues in February of 1936. In them, he talked about how he'd come apart, completely come apart. At the beginning, he said he wanted to make a general observation. And this is his general observation before he begins talking about how he's completely destroyed. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold 2 opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. In quoting that line, in writing that line, he was actually paraphrasing his great hero, the poet John Keats, who said, "A man of achievement, especially in literature, is someone who is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact or reason." And Keats called that negative capability. Psychologists call it detachment. Both terms are inadequate. And the reason they're inadequate is because they're essentially spiritual terms. They're not terms, they're spiritual events. And it's almost impossible to describe spiritual events. At the same time that Fitzgerald was writing his Crack-Up Essays, for which he was excoriated by all the literary world, Hemingway, his editor, his agent, everybody was after him. Dos Passos said, "Christ, man, how do you find time in the middle of the general conflagration to worry about all that stuff? We're living in one of the damnedest tragic moments in history. If you want to go to pieces, I think it's absolutely okay, but I think you ought to write a first-rate novel about it, and you probably will, instead of spilling it in little pieces in Esquire." He was treated as if he had done something, made a rude noise in public. I mean, he was just treated terribly. And he died at the age of 44 in 1940, 4 years later, with his editor refusing to publish the Crack-Up as a book. 5 years later, or maybe 6 years later, right after the Second World War, his best friend, Edmund Wilson, took the book again to his editor, Max Perkins, at Scribner's, and said, I think, I didn't like those essays either. They seemed kind of self-indulgent, but the more I read them, the more I realize he's really getting at something that belonged to everybody, and we should really think again. And Perkins had this wonderfully prissy remark saying that no, he would not publish the book. He considered it that Fitzgerald had committed an indecent invasion of his own privacy. So, best buddy that he was, Edmund Wilson went to a startup press and took off, went to New Directions, which had just started, a very avant-garde press. It's still, and he offered it to New Directions, which published it. It's still in print and still a very important book on their list to this day. So Fitzgerald, who starts out as a popular novelist, ends up posthumously becoming an avant-garde writer. The point of all this is to say how difficult it is to feel you can write from yourself, not again, about yourself. If you read the Crack-Up, you'll think, he's not telling us anything. In our, uber autobiographical age, we expect, all kinds of dirt. He doesn't do that. He uses a lot of metaphor. I mean, he felt as uncomfortable writing about his inner life as all of his friends did about his publishing. However, he knew that, and he actually quotes Matthew at one point, about, that thing about with the salt loses its savor, who will salt the salt, or however that, I've forgotten how that line goes. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is, in 1936, something was beginning to happen, yes, in literature with Fitzgerald, who gets hammered for it. The very same month, February 36, Akron, Ohio. What happened? Anybody in this room know? AA has its first meeting. What is it based on? It is based on telling your story, telling a tale. Sometimes maybe too much, but it was, and not to a therapist, to another human being. These two things, I'm not suggesting that there's a causal relationship between them. There isn't. But this is the way culture works. Things begin happening in different parts of the culture, and they come together in a kind of understanding. And this understanding is not an intellectual understanding. It's the understanding of need and urgency. And out of that time came the rise of the first-person voice, which has always been an American favorite. It's no mistake that our greatest poem is called Song of Myself. Here again, we don't learn a lot about Whitman's life. We have to get his biographies to know he was gay. He didn't talk about that. I mean, you might say, oh, yes, he did. Well, but he didn't say that. He used his conception of the dear love of comrades to give us an idea of democracy. And what about Huck Finn? That boy in central Missouri writing essentially about the slave trade in the first-person voice. And what about Fitzgerald again, writing Gatsby, which is in effect a memoir about the rise of the imperial American enterprise. And of course, Call Me Ishmael, that great big book is predicated on the idea that the story is being told in the first-person voice to us. All of this feels very at home, but yet I think the reason I'm a little troubled by my title is I don't think that most people who are writing are trying to use writing in their lives, spiritually or otherwise. I don't think, and this is based on my 36 years at the university, I'm retiring at the end of this semester. I don't think people are self-absorbed and writing about themselves. I think that they feel they have no business to write about themselves. That typically people think, who would be interested in what I have to say? And I always say to my students, well, aren't you interested? Isn't that where we start? Don't we start with knowing thyself in order to actually have something original to offer to oneself, but also beyond that? Many of you are probably not interested in publishing, yay for you, so that won't pose the problems that some of my students face. But still, I think that we are strangely reticent in using the first-person voice to use it as an instrument rather than as a subject. And I'm a bit evangelical about this because I think that this is the way that you really can have an authentic spiritual relationship, is not simply by reading what other people write about spirituality. I mean, some of our greatest practitioners, Teresa of Avila, and I still have great affection for Teresa of Lisieux. A lot of people think she's not up to it, I think, but I love her. I always have. And of course, again, my great favorite, Augustine. That this is part of our heritage, this memoiristic, autobiographical impulse. Doesn't mean you have to sit down and write an autobiography and talk about the relationship of memory to Genesis in the last 4 books of your confessions, but that you can sit down and begin with an image that comes to your mind either through prayer or just through meditation or silence or staring out a window, and see where it takes you. This is I mean, I've lived my life doing this, so of course I want everybody else to do it. It's a very important part of our reading experience. It's also, I think, part of the American heritage to trust, whether we should or not, that first-person voice. The first-person voice is our voice. There's a reason why nobody is getting advances for epic poems. I mean, Homer doesn't get an advance. We read him in school and everything, but our literature is the literature of the first-person voice. Not just my first-person voice, not Fitzgerald's, but yours as well. Should go into this symphonic relationship, I think. And the other thing to emphasize again is this whole notion that when we're doing this, we are in doubts and mysteries and uncertainties, and that's the whole point. That is not a problem. That's actually, as Keats tells us, that's what you need to have in order to do this work. In order to know thyself, you have to be willing to be in doubts, mysteries, and uncertainties. Christianity is based, unusually, on a single man's life. So we come by this relationship not only through the Delphic oracle of Know Thyself, but also from the fact that we have been focused on the life of a single person. And we have been thinking about it for millennia. So why don't we start thinking about ourselves just for a few minutes every day? Keep a little notebook. One of the things I sometimes urge people to do is to take a small notebook and to write your autobiography on one page every day for a month. One page from beginning to, well, I hope not the end, but wherever we are at the moment. And don't look at the ones you've done before. Just keep writing it every day. 10 minutes, any more than 10 minutes, you're spending too much time on this. And at the end of the month, look at what you've written and to see if you've returned to the same things or if you've bored yourself enough that you've actually come to some other doubt or uncertainty or unknown framed picture that you had in there that you had forgotten about. Ask yourself, what am I surprised I left out? What am I glad I left out? Who must never see this? Who is this for? All of these questions are part of the relationship of writing in the first person voice. It's just for you, you might say, but it really is something that radiates beyond you into your relationships. And I think the very fact that one does not, I've done a lot of these, I don't publish them, gives me a different perspective on my work. Virginia Woolf once said, I do believe that the casual half hours after tea, I always love to think of the way she lived, the casual half hours after tea have influenced my writing in a way that's made it more fluent. And so it's not just your writing, but your thinking, that you can move amongst these images without trying to organize them, is part of what it is to use memoir as a spiritual exercise. What about you? What do you want to talk about? I perhaps made the mistake of not writing this out, and so I've kind of come to the end of, I have all this, but I did want to read it to you, so. Your turn. Quaker prayer meeting, yes, okay.
It strikes me when you talk about the autobiography by day that could easily turn into a log, just listing. I don't think that's what you're saying. Could you say a little bit more about what that writing might encompass?
Well, one of the things that There are two, I mean, I wanted to give you a couple of suggestions for writing. Two, one is that idea of thinking of the album in which you just allow an image to rise up from the past. It could be the distant past, or it could be something that's more recent. Last night, this morning. So that's one. The other one that I just mentioned is it's a timed thing. You should begin one page, 8.5 by 11, and you should begin writing and not stop.
Oh.
And the assignment is your autobiography from the beginning till, and if you're 2 lines from the bottom and you're still 5 years old, that's okay. But just get yourself, and then I went to school, and then I got married and divorced, and and then I came to this lecture, and I'm missing Downton Abbey. Whatever. In other words, you can just go as long as you want. You just follow your life till, and then the little game is that you do bring yourself to the now moment. So it isn't a list, it is a narrative. The other one is a little bit more impressionistic. You're following, it's almost as if you have a photograph and you're describing the photograph. Descriptive writing, rather than active writing, descriptive writing is really what we're after here for this kind of relationship to the spirit. We're not trying to get people in and out of rooms and the things that happen in novels, and we're trying to get you to look, and in your looking to see, because memoir is not really deeply, at least the way I'm thinking of it, is not about what happened to you. It's about what you think about what did or didn't happen. So it's partly narrative, but it's also what we might, this is sort of English department stuff, but essayistic. It's like you're not just telling something, you're also reflecting on it. And that's the magic. The relationship between those two is what we're after.
Okay, so what you're thinking about it, what you're reflecting on, what you're feeling about it.
Sure.
Okay, thanks. That
Yeah,
fills it
yeah.
out. That fills it out.
I think that I guess I would say the feeling is that you say, and I felt so sad. It's the way you describe it that penetrates the feeling and articulates it in a way that talking about feeling doesn't.
Okay,
I think, anyway.
that's helpful.
So you're looking and you're describing. Yeah.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And someone behind, I think, was going to speak.
I had a shy attack.
You what?
I had a shy attack.
Oh, come on.
Does somebody have some buttermilk biscuits?
Now you got over it. You were just,
I did.
yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to make a remark. Can you hear me? Should I get up?
Why don't you get up so everybody can hear?
I was really struck by what you said about, I don't know what date you used, but I would say June 10th of 1935, being a time that AA was founded. And
February 1936, Akron, Ohio.
we'll talk about that. And I agree, and that has affected my life for 35 years very nicely. But what I've seen there, I'm a writer as well, I've written some books about that, and what I've seen happen there sometimes can be a little difficult in a larger kind of social milieu, because what happens is storytelling, number one, how strange, and worse, empathy. And those two things come together there, I think, but I would be interested in your feelings about it, in a way that makes a whole new kind of literature possible.
Well, I'm not a member of AA,
I didn't suspect.
so I've never been to an AA meeting. I've just read about it. I lived with my husband was sober in AA for many, many years, but I never knew him as a drunk. He was 10 years sober by the time I married him. And so I have great respect for it, but I'm not a member or whatever. But I thought it was just kind of eloquent, and maybe I'm making too much of it, but I thought it was eloquent that here's Fitzgerald writing these pieces that are being just treated, he's being treated like he's being kicked in the public square by all of his friends and people who would give anything to be around him. He's being kicked around. publicly. And at that very same time that he's publishing those, there's this beginning of this first-person story. And the reason AA is Alcoholics Anonymous is because there was such shame and such, you could get ruined if somebody knew. I mean, right now, in Hollywood, I'm going to my AA meeting, I mean, it's become a badge, but at that time it was not. And so I just thought that the two things, because they both had I don't want to say literary in a kind of publishing way, but they both had a vocalization quality to them. It was just curious to me that they happened the very same month.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Renee, and I think Tim was over there. Tim, are you going to follow me, Renee? Okay.
Oh,
I think
I thought you were leaving, so I was just thinking, bored.
I thought the talk was terrific, really.
Oh, you're sweet. Thank you.
One of the things that I notice in Augustine in that snapshot kind of way is the death of his friend when he's about a very young man, not yet Christian,
Yeah.
just someone who is, as he says, half of his soul and the other half of himself. But it seems to me that later as he goes through everything, his friendships with Alypius, his friendships with Nebridius, that all of those things sort of amplify that original photograph of that young man and their close relationship, and that they could share everything. And it seems to me that whether it's writing a recommendation letter for someone or whether it's writing a short little story or a long novel, you're always doing that, because what you're seeing, it really, I think it's a memoir because it says, how does the world show itself to me?
That's wonderful. It reminds me, too, of another one of my heroes, Michel Montaigne, a great, progenitor of the essay. And he said that if his great friend, Etienne de Boissy, had not died early, no essays. In other words, he loved talking to his friend so much. They were so close that when he was gone, he had to substitute that. And closer in our own times, we can think of maybe the one indispensable document, personal document out of the Holocaust, is the Diary of Anne Frank, which she begins as a letter to an imaginary friend, Kitty. And it's often interesting to remember that Anne Frank, when she wrote that book, she had not yet been in Bergen-Belsen. She had not seen, although she'd heard some things, she had not yet experienced the thing that we call the Holocaust. But she has become the voice of the Holocaust. Why? Because this indispensable lyric presence, this girl becoming a person, is no more. And so in that specificity, we feel what was lost in the great magnitude. So, I mean, all of these losses become really, they're feeders for articulation and the urgency and the need to articulate. Yeah, I think so. Yes, Timo.
After The Florist's Daughter, one of my favorite memoirs was something called Just Friends by Patti Smith. I don't know if...
Oh, I love that book.
Okay. It's a book I would recommend to
That's a
anybody.
great book, yes.
And one of the things it shares with your memoir, as I recall it, is that it's so narrowly focused on just her relationship with Robert Mapplethorpe, and of course other people like Andy Warhol. I mean, these are larger
And her
than
mom
life.
and dad. I mean,
That's to her mom and dad. But I mean, the point is that I just wonder, as somebody who writes memoirs, do you feel like is it a chore to try to keep your focus on a particular topic without trying to address all the problems of the world and the ages, and because all Patti Smith does is really just talk about her relationship at a particular time in New York City,
Yeah.
and it's just the most amazing book.
Well, I agree. Just Kids is one of the great books of the last, I think, 20 years, and a wonderful book. She's a beautiful writer. If you think about, I mean, I'm sort of making this up, but autobiography, we've been kind of using the words interchangeably, autobiography and memoir, but if we want to kind of make a little definition, we could say everybody has one autobiography. From here to there, it's kind of a line. But you can commit as many memoirs as you want. I'm living proof of that, I mean, how many times do I have to prove that I'm here? One book is about growing up in a Czech family during the Cold War and going behind the Iron Curtain. You don't really know that I'm Catholic in that book. Well, maybe slightly, but it's not really there. The next one, you don't know I'm Czech. I'm only Catholic. I mean, because I'm using that. That's what I'm after. Then in the one you mentioned, The Florist's Daughter, it's really about being a daughter. So, my brother, I dedicated that book to my brother, but he's hardly in it. Why? Because I didn't need him, I mean, he didn't fit what I was after. And in fact, my husband is rarely in anything because usually I'm trying to do something in the Catholic book, Virgin Time. I was reading it and I realized, oh my God, it looks like I'm going to all these monasteries. It looks like maybe I'm thinking of being a nun. I was long married at this point, and I thought I didn't make it up, but I better put in one of the telephone calls home so that the reader knows that I have this guy at home, And so I did that, and once he was there, I was done with him in the book, I mean, I just needed him for that purpose, for that narrative purpose. So it sounds a little cold-blooded, but a book is not a life. A book is just a book, and you take into it what you need for that particular enterprise, I guess I would say. And I think she wrote, I haven't read the next one. Have you read the next memoir? What's it called again? Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I can't put myself on the spot. I haven't read that one, but yeah. Anyway, yes, Lucy.
I've also read Virgin Times and loved it, and The Florist's Daughter, and that's one of the reasons I was interested in being here tonight. But I was intrigued by the suggestion you gave us to write images, to describe images as a form of memoir. And one of the reasons I was interested in that is it's something I started doing a few months ago. And just
We're on the same
because.
wavelength, yeah.
And then I'm wondering, then you wonder, why is it this image and then that image and then this image, and how are they connected? Then you start having all sorts of thoughts about how they're connected. And have you used that in writing? Do you connect the images? Do you have thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, I mean that's a book finally. There's a very funny story about a writer I don't actually like that much, but Vladimir Nabokov his agent was asked how he has these incredible plots and how does he do that? And he said, well, he sits on his balcony over Lac Le Mans after he made $1 million gazillion on Lolita. I hate that book, but anyway. And he has a stack of 3x5 cards. He writes something on the 3x5 card, maybe a name, maybe a whole sentence, maybe a whole paragraph, maybe an adjective. And when Mr. Nabokov has filled out all of the cards, he deals himself a novel.
Oh my goodness.
So I think that our relationship, do I really believe this? The thing is, and this might be worth talking about in terms of your question exactly. we come to writing only because we're readers. We have fallen in, we have been moved, worlds have opened, our eyes have opened interiorly. We love to read. The problem with reading is, here's a book, and when I open it, page 1 automatically follows page 2, 3, 4. They just keep flowing right along. When you write, half of page 48 may come at the beginning. You think it's page 1, but in fact it's later you're going to find out it's the end. And the next 6 pages aren't going to make it at all. They're going to just be thrown out. So our ability to judge how to read, to write is so different. We are not spinning like a spider, a skein of silk. We are getting a little bit here, a little bit there. And so that's why I love that story by Nabokov, because it really shows how broken up it all is. So don't look for the connections too soon.
No.
Keep filling out your cards.
It also makes me think about the nature of memory
Yes.
and what memory are and why they rise. And it made me think of my mother's memories, particularly when she had some dementia, because she developed amazing memories. And I thought, where do memories really come from, and how are they connected, and why now this and why now that?
This is the last 4 books of Augustine's Confessions. He's inquiring of memory itself. So it's not just about stories. It's not even only about images. It's finally about consciousness applying itself to bits of stories. Most memories are incomplete. They are just bits. It's as if we find a shard and we pick it up and we look at it long enough, pretty soon we begin to see, oh, that's that urn that would be shaped like this. But we're making that up. That's not wrong, it's not a lie.
No.
It's an inevitable relationship to memory.
I'll reread Augustine.
Good luck to you on that. You're already halfway there. Yes?
Hi.
Hi there.
I came from Vietnam and I grown up during the Vietnam War. And I saw the war with the eyes of 9 years old. And I came to this country almost 30 years ago. And I married and I have children. It's a new generation in America. And all kind of that. And the transformation from spiritualities to me, and I transform that. I jot down here and there, like you said, every day. I don't do it every day, but whenever I see things that in my soul interpret it, I see it. So I'm always want to ask my question that how can I start a book?
Yes, you've already started it, sounds like to me. The American literature is predicated on stories like yours, generation after generation. There is really no depth to American literature without the immigrant story, without that story bringing to bear its history and relationship, even language, to this experience in this land here at this time. So I would say if you want to write a book about this, you are already in American literature by wanting to do so. That's exactly, one of the great memoirs, I think, of our time is A Walker in the City by Alfred Kazin. And it's about growing up in Brooklyn in a Jewish family, immigrant family. And it's several generations before you came here, but he is doing what you want to do now, and this is done over and over again. And that's why it's the center of American, really in many ways, the center of American literature. The other thing I'd say is find a writing group. Do you live here or do you live in the Twin Cities?
No, we live in Sioux City, Iowa.
You live in Iowa?
Yep.
Where?
Sioux City.
Sioux City. I don't know where to tell you to go, but I know there are people, small groups, sometimes groups of women, who like to meet together to work on their writing. And so finding a community writing class, not a bad idea. Not forever, but just as a way to have some kind of setting in which you can be semi-public. You know, you'll begin to see, you read something aloud and somebody laughs and you think, oh, I was hoping they'd laugh. Or you look up and you see somebody has a tear in their eye, they got it. Or you see them looking away, they're bored. You think, oh, I guess I kind of knew that wasn't working. You know, that kind of thing is very valuable if you want to move into some kind of more public relationship with your writing. I'm sorry I don't know where to suggest you go because I don't know that community, but I know they're out there. And and then of course reading, read. There are a number of wonderful Vietnamese memoirs. You probably know some of them. Stealing Buddha's Dinner, do you know that one? Mm-mm. It's a wonderful book. You might want to look at it by, I've forgotten her name. It's the classic Vietnamese last name, Nguyen, you know, but I can't remember her first name. Anyway, Stealing Buddha's Dinner, wonderful memoir. But maybe you don't want to read it because you want to write your own. You don't want to read about a Vietnamese. Because one time, Stuart Dybek, who's a Polish American, wrote about his background, and somebody said to his Catholic background, he said he was asked, "What Catholic writers have influenced you?" He said, "None. Jewish writers. I figured if they can do with their culture what they did, I can do with mine the same thing." So you might not even want to read Stealing Buddha's Dinner, but anyway.
True. All right. Thank you.
Good luck to you. I want to read that book.
Many thoughts. I'm a therapist of many, many seasons, and I think about the file cabinets that are filled with stories of other people. Mm-hmm. And a couple of years ago, I taught at I still teach at St. Claus State, but I taught at the Reformatory. Ah. And these were young people between the ages of 18 and 42. And in the class that I taught, partly a storytelling class, but it was through the lens of birth order.
A birth order.
And they would call their parents. They had permission to use the phone, call parents or relatives, and ask about their growing up. And then they would report to the class, like 3 or 4 minute summary of that. And many of them had never asked their parents about what it was like to be a kid. Mm. And it was just amazing. I get to write about a lot of other people's stories in my clinical files. And when I first meet with clients, I ask them to bring a picture or a symbol of something they're proud of. And that pivots around, it just opens up volumes of stories, because I'm a great believer, I love metaphors, and oftentimes I have a bag of rocks in my office that I often give people. They're Lake Superior rocks, came out of the earth, and they're rock solid, and everyone is different, and they hold that rock. All kinds of stories about that. But the other thing that I heard this morning on Meet the Press, Beto was being interviewed, the guy that's running, and the interviewer asked, "What are the 5 books that you would recommend?" Maybe you heard it. One, he said, was The Odyssey. The other one was The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell. And I don't think any other politician would have mentioned those books. So,
So you're going to work for Beto.
part.
You're going to work for him.
So I love what you're saying about the, and I have written a lot about, even when I started in prep school here, way back in Another World, I kept a diary, and I still have those. And over the last 10, 15 years, I write, it's hundreds and hundreds of pages. Most of it is not for public consumption. But I find that it is a powerful metaphor through which, from which I am viewing my life. And I like the idea of writing for 30 days through a various lens. Like I've told my story of my life through the dogs in my life, and through the places I've owned, and the cars I've owned. And I've told those stories to a couple of my daughters, which is an interesting metaphor for other fragments of my life. Just one other thought, many years ago in another land, I was giving a talk about addictions and therapy, and I said, clinical issues are fragments of whole stories. And we only get to hear a few of the fragments, but there's a deep, deep, thick story behind all those fragments.
Really, that's the economy of literature itself.
Thank you.
You give me your story, Leo Tolstoy, whether it's about Anna Karenina or Pierre Bolkonsky or whoever it is, and in some unfathomable way, I get my story. So that is at the root of why literature works and why some books endure. And also you said something I thought was very important. It isn't just about, again, I'm hammering this, it isn't about writing about yourself. It's about writing from yourself. So you might be writing about your mother, or you might be writing about the tree outside your window. Anything that your attention fastens on is worthy and will lead you somewhere. So I think that that's a very important part of why to write. And writing slows you down. You can't rush when you're writing. I mean, you can write fast if you want to, but in the end, the mind and it's kinesthetic writing. And I've noticed, I try to write by hand now and again because it's way too easy to hit the keyboard, you know, those ivories. I mean, I can go much faster. Whereas the thought patterns, especially when you can't erase, as you can so easily on the computer, you know, you're centered in some way. I'm sorry to use such a kind of cliched image, but anybody else? We're kind of...
Peter.
Thank you for the talk. I tend to think of writing as an act we do for somebody else, but I hear in your description of memoir that it would be beneficial for really all of us to write for ourselves, not about ourselves, but as a process of thinking. So that this journal you suggest or other forms of daily writing practice could just be about working out what we're thinking about and help us to be able to articulate or settle on where we're at any given moment. Not necessarily for publication, just for itself.
Yeah, not at all for publication. I mean, just for... In fact, I think this is something that professional writers have to renew in themselves all the time. Because in a way, we're in the business, we know, you know, I've got an agent, I've got an editor, I've got an assignment, I've got a deadline, and I have to pretend that doesn't exist. I have to pretend, oh, I'm just seeing what's coming, you know. And you can, I mean, I lie to myself about so many things. You'd think I could do it about that. So what you're saying is absolutely true. I mean, all of the art is predicated on paradox. That's why, you know, my favorite one is you must lose your life in order to gain it. One of the great spiritual aphorisms and truths that we could mine forever, and this is sort of what you have to do as a writer too. Whether you're a professional writer or not, you have to just do it because you're trying to find out what's in there, and you may not. You don't write what you know. You don't think something and then you write it. You start writing and find out. That's why I want you to do 30 of those autobiographies, because eventually you'll just, okay, here I am again, another 10 minutes at this, you know, and something will come up. You have to kind of trick yourself into not having great intentions, not having expectations, and just putting yourself in the presence, right? I'm starting to sound rather Buddhist after all, but, so, yes.
So I think you're kind of getting at it now, but I'm curious about the power of memoir in a culture now that feels like it is so focused on like the carefully curated autobiography. What is the power then of engaging in that writing of memoir? How has that been for you? How have you seen that in your students' lives?
Well, yeah, it's a little unsettling to have a 23-year-old come in and say, hi, I'd like to be a memoirist. And I feel like, no, you don't want to do that, you know. But I can't have it both ways. I can't, on the one hand, have this form that I think is so protean and invites so much, you know, not just narrative, but the thinking, you know, this intersection between storytelling and reflection, and at the same time deny these kiddos the chance to try their hand at it. I would say that still at the university, at least in our program, the biggest number of applicants come to fiction. And so, you know, it's still the kind of the protean fountainhead of the imaginative world. And hey, guess what I'm writing right now? A novel. So I don't know, I didn't really answer it, did I? What, help me a little, did I?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I'm just curious about that. Sorry.
I think we can hear you, you've got a good voice.
Okay. Yeah, just that it seems like we're living in a world that is so defined
Oh,
by
yes.
how we carefully
Yeah.
present ourselves,
Yeah.
the events of our lives, and that's very different than the process you're talking about.
Right.
About the power of that.
Well, you know, I get sick of what the English call the misery memoirs, and you know, and there were, well, I won't go on literary gossip, but I mean, there are all sorts of people who use this form that I've been talking about, and perhaps an overly idealistic way, in ways that I think are, you know, pretty cheap. And hey, there are bad novels out there. And there are bad poems, and guess what? They're lousy memoirs. And maybe I've written one or two myself, but I think that what we're talking about here is not the publication of books, but the use of this kind of writing in one's life. So I think there was some, yes.
Thanks for your thought-provoking remarks. It's interesting you brought up AA, you know, Alcoholics Anonymous, and memoir in the same context. But sitting here, you said you never went to an AA meeting, but
No.
I've been going to them for 12 years, so I could tell you all about it. But what really struck me was that people that tell their stories in AA are really telling memoirs.
Yes.
Because the AA meeting basically is surrounded with, focused on a theme of some sort, and people relate their personal recovery in relationship to that theme. So in effect, it is a memoir, isn't it?
It is, it's,
Sort of a memoir.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, and I think here we might have occasionally a problem of the sort that you, Twin Cities, twins, go Twins, said. In other words, sometimes those stories can become rather practiced and predictable and self-regarding. That's not really what we're after here. We're after surprising ourselves and finding something that we wouldn't know otherwise. I don't mean to say that that's the way it always is in AA. I wouldn't know, and I don't have that feeling from what I do know about it. I'm an enthusiast as far as that goes. But I do think that sometimes when stories become rehearsed and practiced, it's a problem. I know that one of the reasons I'm pleased to be retiring after 36 years at the university is because I don't think it's healthy to be an expert and an authority all the time, because that's exactly not what I have to be when I sit at my own desk. I have to be an idiot, willing to give it a try. But when I'm in front of the classroom, I'm supposed to know what I'm talking about, and I've become sort of allergic to that. I just don't want to do it anymore. And it's not because I don't love the students, well, I don't love all of them, but I mean, you know, it's not because I don't kind of get a hit out of being in front of them, a captive audience, but it's just enough already. I want to go back into a completely unarmed situation, you know, that's what I want. And so I think that I'm after trying to avoid the very thing I'm talking about, you know, being predictable. We could do one more, but then I think we have to.
I want to thank you at this point.
Oh,
and
thank you.
Thank you for a very engaging, thoughtful, and
Thank you for sitting there
informative
so long.
presentation. Thank you, and thank you for. Let's give a warm round of thanks.
Thank you.
On April 7th, we will have our own Jesse Bazan here giving us a presentation called Vessel of Voices, the Call of a Spiritual Writer. So we look forward to Jesse being with us on April 7th. And finally, and thank you for being here tonight on St. Patty's Day. And there are food and refreshments in the back of the room. So thank you.